who missed the first bit, I'm just going to be presenting the research on vigilante. And a formal definition of a vigilante is somebody who scans their environment for wrongdoing and metes out some unauthorized punishment of wrongdoing. So policing and without consent. And we really seem to be living in an age of the vigilante. There is this growing number of individuals who are willing to circumvent established procedures and really take justice into their own hands. And they're doing this either as lone operators or through collective organising, which is increasingly easy to do via social media and online forums. And this trend isn't just overseas in places like the United States. It is happening here locally in Queensland. So just last month, the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner called for greater scrutiny of vigilante activity in the wake of escalating appeals or in some Facebook groups for violent retaliation in response to youth crime. And vigilantes aren't just a societal level issue, they're also in our workplaces. So a few years ago now, DeSales and Aquino published this paper, and they reported in a sample of US workers that nearly 58% of them had worked alongside a vigilante at some point during their career, and that around 18% currently worked alongside one. They found that vigilantes are across almost every industry, but some sectors are less immune than others, including education and public administration. And I guess when we're talking about workplace vigilantism, I guess the most salient example that gets a lot of press coverage is what we term cancel culture, where people are publicly shunned and punished for perceived moral failings. But in reality, vigilantism occurs for a wide range of reasons and often over really typically minor offences, things like rocking up to work, a couple of minutes late your shift, not wearing a tie when you're supposed to, and the old classic of leaving food in the fridge. The effects of vigilantism are really complex, and I just want to highlight this. So there are some good aspects to vigilantism. For one, it can bring injustices to light where they may otherwise be ignored, and Tyler and Addison qualitative work asking participants what they think might be some positive aspects of vigilantism, and this seems to be a recurring theme. Monitoring and punishment are really effective ways to increase conformity. This actually might be really good in some industries that have strict safety standards, and that's following, the rules to a T ensures, your own life and the safety of other people's lives, things like construction. And vigilantism can serve as types of proto laws. They identify gaps in our system that we might need to formalise. So during COVID, we saw people taking justice into their own hands, people breaching, perceived rules. And so you saw a lot of hotlines sort of crop up so that vigilantism could be avoided in those instances. There are bad sides to vigilantism, though. It can rob people of due process and opportunities for more restorative forms of justice. And this can create negative conditions, not just for the target of vigilantes, but for bystanders watching on. People can lose faith in the system, be really fearful of making mistakes, and ironically, really try to cover up mistakes instead of bringing them to light, just for fear of retribution. And there are really ugly sides to vigilantism, especially when it rises to the level of physical violence and threats. And Sam Tannenhouse at the Washington Post had a great article really outlining how the January 6th attack on the Capitol was an instance of vigilantism. So we still, despite there being sort of anecdotal and lots of qualitative sort of analyses of vigilantes, we actually still know little psychologically and quantitatively about how vigilantes develop over time and what their impacts are in the workplace. So Tyler and I have a program of research doing some qualitative work on a longitudinal panel study, the latter of which I'll take you through some of the preliminary findings now. So one thing that is important to recognise is that historically things might be changing in this arena, but most people will use formal channels to resolve grievances and raise issues. Because ultimately vigilantism is a non-violation in response to a non-violation. There's a tautology kind of to it. So Chen and colleagues came out with this great paper just last year, and they proposed that for some people, overcoming this barrier of committing a non-violation is easier when they've internalized vigilante identity. So they've internalized themselves that they are a monitor and a punisher of wrongdoing in the world. And of course, as this identity becomes sustainable and a sense of self, there are compulsions to sort of satisfy the behavioural demands associated with that identity. But again, we don't know how that develops over time. So we've got some longitudinal research trying to sort of maybe tease that apart. One proposed reason for the emergence of vigilantes is this combination of normative threat as well as low social control. So when important norms or values are under threat and authorities aren't doing anything about it, or they aren't doing anything about it to a satisfactory level, that constitutes a justice failure. It can erode trust in the system to handle concerns effectively. And in these instances, vigilantism becomes this kind of compensatory mechanism to overcome this and re-establish normative order again. So in this case, value incongruence may increase vigilante identification over time in the workplace. And the greater organizational control in the workplace potentially could be associated with lower vigilante identification over time. But we're proposing an additional pathway, not an alternative pathway, but an additional one to the normative threat and low social control sort of hypothesis. And that is that competitive environments may foster vigilante identities. And there is a couple of reasons why this might be. So if people are in a competitive environment, they're contesting, important resources, things like promotions, rewards, prestige in the workplace. It makes sense that people will be scanning their environment for wrongdoing in order to deter cheaters. So it's a way to re-establish, fairness. There's also another reason why competition rates promote vigilante identification over time, and it's a little bit darker than that reason. And that's because monitoring and punishing others is a really effective way to exert dominance over others and cut down your rivals. So I do a lot of research on social dominance, orientation, and we know from sort of decades of research that competitive and unequal environments seem to foster greater levels of social dominance in people. Doing so also, cuts down one's rivals, but also elevates one's status relative to others. It gives a sense of moral superiority. So we're arguing that competition may be a key factor in promoting vigilante identification over time. But because vigilante identification is this internalized sort of central concept of oneself, the behavioural demands associated with that, one who is a guardian of, policing wrongdoing and things like that, it should elicit this feedback loop whereby people with higher vigilante identification should also start viewing their co-workers as having less congruent values with them, being more competitive, and thinking that the organisation doesn't have the goods to kind of control the situation. So this is the proposed model. It is going to be tested with 3 waves. We're still just selecting wave 3 at the moment, but I thought I'd give you a teaser of the first 2 waves. So we sampled US workers from the pick. We targeted around 1,000, but after retention checks, so they was 790. Most employees are just paid employees, so they're not self-employed. And there's this really good sort of range of people working remotely. Some will never work remotely, some will work remotely. And we surveyed participants 8 weeks apart. We asked them about their vigilante identity. So I'm the kind of person who takes it upon themselves to monitor others for signs of wrongdoing. Their value incongruence. So I feel like people in my workplace and I don't share the same values. Competitive climate. So everyone at work wants to win by outperforming their co-workers. And organisational control. So items like written rules are strictly enforced in my organisation. And we control for age, gender and tenure. There is some evidence suggesting that those are associated with different levels of vigilantism. So in terms of the results, it was a bit of a, there's lots of arrows. So the autoregressive pathways showed that each construct exhibited relative stability over time. And then what we found in terms of the cross-linked paths was that higher competitive work environments were associated with higher vigilante identification over time. Consistent with this feedback sort of loop, people higher in vigilante identification also perceived that their co-workers were more competitive over time as well. There were no significant cross-linked effects between organisation control and vigilante identification, which was quite surprising. And only the vigilante identification to value incongruence path was significant. So people with higher vigilante identification tend to view their co-workers as having less congruent values over time, although p-value is kind of hovering a little higher. So I'm running out of time, so I'll just wrap up. So basically, it looks like there is this feedback loop between vigilante identification and competitive work environments. So organisations should potentially limit perceptions of competition in the workplace if they want to avoid sort of extrajudicial acts of vigilantism among their workers. Interestingly, there's no evidence in the study that value incongruence or low organisational control shape vigilante identification over time, but vigilantes might view greater misalignment of values with their co-workers over time. So that's kind of consistent with the self-perpetuating cycle associated with the vigilance identity. So in terms of what's next, It was surprising not finding that value and congruence and low organizational control were associated with greater vigilante identification over time. But the issue with longitudinal panel studies is that they are often lacking in sort of context-rich information, where sampling participants were dispersed across a wide range of organisations. And so it might just be that normative threat is very context-specific. Maybe the severity of the transgression plays an important role. And again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it's likely it does play a role, but we just don't find evidence for that in this study. But, there was this feedback loop between competitive work environments and vigilantism. I forgot to mention those cross-leg paths, there was no significant difference. So we can't sort of establish a range of causality or anything like that. But it's unclear why. Is it because people want to elicit greater cooperation and actually deter cheating? Or is it sort of a bit more nefarious and dominance motivated to elevate one's status, sort of cut down people's rivals? So we're hoping to do some further studies to disentangle those possibilities. And of course, again, this is between person stability. Once we get that third wave, we're going to model within person change over time to see if that holds within person. Okay,